Over 500 years, Europeans ransacked ancient Egyptian tombs for riches, antiquities, medicinal ingredients, and even painting materials. Here are two stories of travelers during the turn of last century who ruefully came to realize the power of ancient Egyptians to impact their lives centuries later. The Princess's Hand. Count Louis Hayman was a famed astrologer and psychic healer at the turn of the last century. Obviously successful, he was often given exotic presents by grateful clients. In 1890, on a visit to Luxor, Egypt, Hayman cured a prominent sheikh of malaria and felt obliged to accept a gruesome gift of thanks: the mummified right hand of a long-dead Egyptian princess. The story behind it was as horrific as the dry, shriveled artifact. In 1357 BC, King Akhenaten of Egypt, the father-in-law of Tutankhamun, had argued over religious matters with his daughter and took ghastly vengeance. He had the young woman violated and dispatched by his priests, who later cut off her right hand and buried it secretly in the Valley of the Kings. The king's subjects were appalled by the act, as the princess would be barred from paradise due to her body not being intact at burial. Hayman tried to pass the relic onto a museum, but none would accept it, so he locked it away in an empty safe in the wall of his London home. 30 years later, in October 1922, he and his wife reopened the safe and started back in horror. The unfortunate princess's hand was completely transformed. Shriveled and mummified for 3,200 years, it had begun to soften with new flesh. The Countess screamed that it had to be destroyed, and although Hayman had never before been afraid of the unknown, he agreed with her. However, he did insist that the hand must be given the best funeral they could provide. On the night of October 31st, 1922, whether coincidentally or not Halloween, they were ready to provide such a ceremony. Hayman recounted that evening's events in a later letter to his friend, the archaeologist Lord Carnarvon, whose expedition was currently undergoing work in Egypt. Hayman had gently laid the hand in the fireplace and read aloud a passage from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. As he closed the book, there was a blast of thunder that rocked the house into total darkness. The door flew open with an instantaneous rush of wind. Hayman and his wife fell to the floor and lay there in the sudden icy cold, and on raising their eyes saw the figure of a woman. According to Hayman's description, she wore the royal apparel of old Egypt, bearing the serpent of the House of Egypt, which glittered on her tall headdress. The woman's right arm ended in a raw stump. The astonishing apparition bent over the fire and then disappeared as suddenly as it had materialized. The severed hand had vanished with it and was never seen again. 4 days later, Hayman read that the Carnarvon expedition had discovered Tutankhamun's tomb and was planning to enter it, despite the ancient warning emblazoned at its threshold. From the room in the hospital, where he and his wife were still being treated for severe shock, Hayman sent Carnarvon a letter begging him to hold back. He wrote, "I know now that the ancient Egyptians had knowledge and power of which we today have no comprehension. In the name of God, I beg you to take care." Carnarvon was to ignore the warning in Hayman's letter, and soon afterwards had perished from an infected mosquito bite. One by one, members of his expedition followed him to the grave in what became known as the Curse of the Pharaohs, which has been calculated by those who believe in it to have claimed over 20 lives. Priestess of Death. In 1910, Egyptologist Douglas Murray was approached by a disheveled-looking man in Cairo. Despite the man's furtive manner and signs of a terminal illness, Murray was drawn in by his offer of the most priceless find of his career. It was the mummy casket of a high priestess in the temple of Amun-Ra, who was known to have lived in Thebes in 1600 BC. The outside of the well-preserved case bore the image of the princess, exquisitely worked in enamel and gold. Murray was an avid collector and could not resist the purchase, giving the man a cheque and arranging for the mummy case to be shipped to his London home. His cheque was never cashed, as the seller passed away that night, and Murray was soon to be informed by another Egyptologist in Cairo why the price had been so reasonable. The priestess from Amun-Ra had held high office in the powerful cult of the dead, and her casket was apparently protected by a curse. The cult was alleged to have turned the fertile valley of the Nile River into a dark and deadly realm. Inscribed on the walls of her burial chamber, the priestess had left an invocation of misfortune and terror for anyone who desecrated her final resting place. Murray scoffed at the superstition until 3 days later. He had gone on a shooting expedition up the Nile, and the gun he was carrying exploded mysteriously in his hand. After experiencing weeks of agony in hospital, his arm had to be amputated above the elbow. On Murray's return voyage to England, 2 of his friends passed away from unknown causes. 2 Egyptian servants who had handled the mummy case also died within the year. On arriving back in London to be reunited with the delivered casket, Murray suddenly found the carved face of the priestess chilling and proceeded with his plan to get rid of it. A woman friend persuaded him to give it to her, and within weeks her mother had died, her lover had deserted her, and she was stricken with a mysterious, undiagnosed wasting disease. When she instructed her lawyer to make her will, he insisted on returning the case to Douglas Murray. Now quite distraught, Murray presented the mummy case to the British Museum. But strange events reflective of the curse continued to occur as soon as the priestess was installed in the Egyptian room. It was reported that the museum's night watchman often heard frantic hammering and sobbing coming from the coffin. Other exhibits in the room were frequently held about at night. One watchman died while on duty, creating fear in the other watchmen who wanted to quit. Cleaners also refused to go anywhere near the mummy case. A photographer who took pictures of it reportedly dropped dead, and an Egyptologist in charge of the exhibit was also found deceased in his bed. Amidst adverse publicity in the newspapers, the board of the museum met in secret and made a unanimous decision to ship the mummy case to a New York museum. The American institution had agreed to accept the gift, provided it was handled without media coverage and sent by the safest possible means. The case was to be shipped by a prestigious new White Star liner, making her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York that month. All arrangements were smoothly completed, but the mummy case never reached New York. It was in the cargo hold of the supposedly unsinkable liner called the Titanic when it carried 1,498 people to their doom on April 15, 1912. As a result, it is difficult to verify this narrative, particularly as the so-called unlucky mummy in the Egyptian rooms of the British Museum has become confused with the original mummy case over time. No problems have been reported with this artifact, which is actually a painted inner coffin lid. The museum describes it as showing a depiction of an unnamed priestess of Amun-Ra who once dwelt beneath it. If the original casket of another Amun-Ra priestess did exist, it is now at the bottom